So as we get into our discussion about the House of M, what we're going to be doing here is we're going to be jumping back to the old way in which I used to discuss videos. That's not to say we're going to have this cascading comic book panels or anything, but we're going to go very in-depth into the House of M here. And the reason why is because the House of M was a pivotal story for the mutant community in the 2000s. This was the mutant community's version of Civil War, not in the sense that they were fighting among each other, but in the sense that this was the story that had basically, I guess maybe changed everything for the mutant community. Now, the reason behind why the House of M event had come around is because in the year 2000, Joe Quesada, who was previously an artist, had stepped into the role of editor-in-chief for Marvel Comics. And in an interview in 2005 with ICV2, what Joe Quesada had said was that there were basically too many mutants, that what had made the mutants so unique and so easy to maybe relate to was the fact that they were a very small group of people who were being oppressed by society at large. And so people could identify with this aspect. They could look at this and they could feel for these characters. But now in 2005, there were just so many mutants. And in truth, the term mutant had become a scapegoat. If there was a situation whereby writers needed someone with some kind of a power, they could just chalk them up and say they were mutants. And it had really become, I guess, maybe gotten to this place where it wasn't what it should have been, that somehow it began to deviate away from its initial intention. And so what Joe Quesada did is he came along and just told Marvel to stop. And he wiped the slate clean. He said, we're going to basically redo everything when it comes to the mutant population. And explicitly, he had stated again, I guess sourcing back to this interview, that he didn't really have any intention as far as he was editor-in-chief to bring mutants back to their previous population. That is to say, after the events of House of M, mutants were going to stay as a very, very small number and then maybe even incrementally increase their ranks, which is exactly what we saw following the events of the House of M. But as we get into this story, as we pick up with part one, what we find here is that we join Wanda Maximoff, and Wanda Maximoff has given birth to twins. And what we see is that Doctor Strange is congratulating her on the fact that she's given birth to twins. And I would like you to take a very particular notice of this. What's basically happening is that the characters that she's surrounded by, Wonder Man, Doctor Strange, Magneto, or Quicksilver, we really can't tell from this perspective, and especially the Vision, these characters have their own personalities, they have their own sentience, they have their own ideologies. And in fact, when we see that the Vision congratulates her, he congratulates her in the exact same way that a father would. Now, one thing to keep in mind is that these characters are maybe caricatures or a reflection of how she perceived her life should have been, but the fact remains that these are characters that have their own ideologies. And this is very important as we go forward with the House of M, because what we're going to see is that when Scarlet Witch warps reality, when she changes everything, it's not as though people are going to be puppets for her whim. It's not as though it's going to be a reflection of the Crooked World storyline of Mad Jim Jaspers. This is going to be a story whereby everybody's leading a totally separate life. And so what we do is we continue with this as we see that that Charles Xavier appears, and Charles Xavier tells her she has to set the world back, that she has no children, and that there's no one in this room but Charles Xavier and the Scarlet Witch herself. Now, in truth, Charles Xavier's probably lying here. He's probably lying to her. And the reason why we know that is because, again, the Scarlet Witch can warp reality. We saw with the Kree warship, the Kree battleship had appeared and people had died because of that. It wasn't a mass hallucination. It wasn't something that was being witnessed by people but didn't actually exist. Those things were really taking place. And so this leads us to believe that Charles Xavier is duping her here, that he's somehow doing what he can to try to get her to believe that this is actually an illusion, that this isn't really happening. And so we see that the Scarlet Witch really begins to demonstrate just how far gone she is, just how psychotic she is, and the fact that she's lost her mind when she's absolutely convinced that these children are real, when she's absolutely convinced that everything that's going on at this moment is real. And in fact, we see the Vision comment and tell Charles Xavier not to speak to his wife that way, again, demonstrating that the Vision has his own concepts here, his own ideologies. And so again, as both Wanda Maximoff and Charles Xavier get into an argument and they continue to yell back and forth, Charles Xavier seems to maybe overcome himself with regards to this particular scenario. And again, what this does is tell us just how powerful the Scarlet Witch is. The fact that Charles Xavier, with all his vast abilities, is having a very difficult time piercing this veil of reality altering that she's basically created, and using every ounce of the power that he has to effectively get her to set things right is really taking its toll here. And so we eventually see that Scarlet Witch acquiesces and everything seems to shatter. And so what we see here is that Charles Xavier begins comforting the Scarlet Witch. And again, the Scarlet Witch's insanity becomes prevalent here in the sense that she believes, or she really thinks, that what's happened is really what's going on. That in fact, that because of her actions, she had killed the Avengers. That because of her actions, she had killed the Vision. Now, the Vision is a very interesting subject with regards to Avengers Disassembled and the House of M event. And the reason why is because, of course, during the events of Avengers Disassembled, we had seen that the Vision had died. But the question is that we don't know whether or not the Vision died as a result of the actions of Scarlet Witch. That is to say, he began spewing out all these different versions of Ultron because of her actions, or if that was something Ultron had, I guess maybe a program that Ultron had installed in the Vision, so that if the Avengers sent out a white call distress signal, that the Vision would respond accordingly. That's something that we don't know, but Scarlet Witch seems to assume, or at the very least believe, that she is the reason for this. And so again, we see Charles Xavier bleeding from the nose, indicating that he's maybe reached a realization that the Scarlet Witch simply cannot be contained here. And so what we do is we switch over to Charles Xavier in the early morning, or perhaps the sunset, we're not really sure, but he's speaking with Magneto. And Magneto says that he had heard some screaming in the night. And what Charles says is that this is really a circumstance. Everything that's going on is something that just can't be controlled here. That there's basically, I guess, events unfolding in such a way to where every time the Scarlet Witch uses her powers, every time she alters reality, she loses her grasp on reality. But more so than that, she seems to actually be maybe getting more adept, or maybe getting more powerful every time she uses her abilities, to the point where Charles Xavier really can't keep her contained. There really isn't anything he can do. And so what he had done is he had basically psychically maybe induced sleep. He had basically tricked her mind into believing that it was time for her to go to sleep. But what Magneto says here is that they can't keep doing this. They can't keep using tranquilizers, and they can't keep tricking her mind into going to sleep, because it's simply inhumane. But again, Charles says that there really wasn't anything that he can do here. There really isn't anything that he can do on his own. He's not really sure what to do. And so what happens is we ultimately switch to Manhattan, to New York, and we see that as things are progressing, that Wonder Man, that Carol Danvers, that other members are beginning to file their way to Avengers Mansion. Now keep in mind, again, this is after the events of Avengers Disassembled, and so Stark Tower is maybe the residence to the Avengers, so to speak. I guess what's left of them, or people might loosely call themselves Avengers, but the fact remains that under this particular circumstance, everybody's meeting up in this one particular location. And what we find is that once you actually arrive inside of Stark Tower after the Avengers do, they're greeted by a multitude of superheroes, by the combined forces of the Avengers, as well as Doctor Strange, Robert Reynolds, the Sentry, Charles Xavier. And Charles tells them that for the most part, they're trying to figure out what to do here, that they need to discuss the fate of Wanda Maximoff, indicating to us that Charles Xavier is toying with the possibility of the fact that Wanda Maximoff may very well have to die here in order to preserve their universe. And so what we do is we switch back to Wanda Maximoff, to Scarlet Witch, as she's meeting with Quicksilver. And of course, she's sleeping at this point in time. She's unconscious. And what Quicksilver is doing is basically just looking at her, just reconciling over the knowledge that he's learned, the information that indicates to him, at least as far as he was able to overhear from Charles Xavier's conversation, that the intention of the Avengers and the X-Men is to kill the Scarlet Witch. And in fact, he tells this to Magneto. He tells Magnus that they're going to kill his daughter. And Magneto seems a little surprised by this, but even then, he doesn't really seem that concerned. And when Quicksilver begins to freak out, when he begins to, I guess maybe lash out at Magneto, Magneto asks the question, what's he supposed to do? What is it that he could do here? There really isn't anything he can do to not only stop the powers of the Scarlet Witch, but to also keep the Avengers or the X-Men from killing her, because in reality, in the back of Magneto's mind, I'm willing to wager, he feels there's no other choice here, that her power is simply just grown beyond her ability to control. Even more so than that, it's grown beyond the ability for her sanity to maintain. And so she's a danger not just to this reality, but possibly other realities. And so again, we see that Quicksilver begins to succumb to his anguish here, and maybe Magneto seems to do the same. But what happens is Quicksilver leaves, and Magneto leaves his daughter along with him. And so again, what we do is we switch back to Charles Xavier, to the Avengers and the X-Men, and we see them entertaining this idea. We see them talking about this idea, but of course, as we would expect, the idea is really split down the middle. There are some people like Spider-Man and Cyclops and Captain America who say this doesn't need to happen, that she's not some kind of a dog, she's not an animal that has rabies you can just put down, that she's a human. But what's also really splitting the crowd here is that Scarlet Witch was an Avenger at one point in time, but she's also a mutant. And so the idea here is that the X-Men should handle this in-house. But again, Captain America says that she was an Avenger and that it should be handled by the Avengers. And so again, we see that as various people are beginning to argue, as various people are beginning to debate here, that ultimately the group comes to the conclusion that at the very least, even if they're not going to decide right then and there they should kill her, that they should travel to Genosha and at the very least talk to her directly. And so what happens here is the group bands together and they leave and they travel to Genosha. But one thing to keep in mind here is that all this is after Grant Morrison's run of the X-Men, and so Cassandra Nova has already wiped out 16 million mutants that were currently housed in Genosha, and so as a result, Genosha is a total war zone. And so what we find is that when the Avengers and the X-Men arrive at where Wanda Maximoff is supposed to be, that Wanda Maximoff is gone, that she's completely vanished. Now we'll find out at the end of the story exactly what had taken place that had led to this circumstance and led to the entire events as they unfolded in the House of M. But the immediate reaction of the Avengers and the X-Men is that they need to find her. And so what they do is they start to fan out, they start to look around, but then suddenly they realize that Charles Xavier's gone, that he simply just vanished, and they don't really know how it was that this has happened. And so the first thing, I guess their first goal here is to find a way to locate Charles Xavier, is to find where Charles Xavier is, and then as soon as they find him, to get out of there. And then after that, they'll figure out some way to deal with the Scarlet Witch. But what we also see here is that Doctor Strange is, I guess, analyzing the mystic patterns, and he's not finding any trace of Wanda Maximoff. But as the group continues, as they travel, they eventually find to where they believe Wanda Maximoff is. Now Emma Frost here is using her telepathic powers to locate Wanda Maximoff, but again, we see that various other individuals, Tony Stark using his infrared sensors, and Doctor Strange are unable to identify her being there. Of course, with Tony Stark using his infrared sensors, he can't see any body heat, and Doctor Strange saying that whenever Wanda Maximoff uses her powers, it leaves a trace of sorts, or it leaves some kind of magical indicator that he can recognize, but there's no recognition of her being here, being anywhere in the vicinity. And so again, as the group is continuing to traverse around, as they're continuing to investigate, we ultimately see that various people start disappearing in sequence, ultimately leaving Spider-Man as the sole person here. And so what happens as this comic begins to come to a close is that we pick up with Spider-Man as everything begins to turn white. And then when everything seems to resettle itself, we pick up with Peter Parker as he wakes up to a crying baby. And Peter Parker's told by some unidentified woman that it's Peter's turn, indicating that it's most likely his turn to check on the baby and make sure everything's okay. And what we see is that in a picture next to Peter Parker's bedside table is Peter Parker, who is apparently married to Gwen Stacy. With that being said, we're going to go ahead and bring this video to an end. I hope you guys enjoyed it. If you did, let me know, and I will catch you guys later. Peace. Be sure to follow me on Twitter. There you can keep up with all the updates from Comics Explained and talk to me directly.